Hello, and thank you for joining me again. It's been about a week since I've recorded any devotional thoughts. Last week was a bit busy with the holiday and things going on, and I didn't get around to recording, but I definitely want to keep the devotional thoughts going. And today I'm going to speak from Exodus chapter number 3. Been reading in Exodus most recently, and in Exodus chapter number 3 we have the familiar account of Moses at the burning bush. And Moses had been brought up in the house of Pharaoh. He was a Jewish boy that had been rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and brought up in Pharaoh's household, growing up as an Egyptian, yet knowing his Hebrew roots, and through some circumstances had ended up killing a man and having to flee from Egypt, and was in exile for 40 years from what would be his homeland. And during that time in exile, after 40 years, the Bible tells us that Moses was tending a flock of sheep, and he was on a mountain, and he saw a burning bush. The bush burned with fire, yet the bush was not consumed, and it caught Moses' eye. He wanted to see what was going on with the bush, so he turned aside to gaze at this sight, and from the middle of the bush came the voice of God, calling Moses to go back to Egypt to rescue, or to deliver rather, the people of Israel from the bondage that they were in the land of Egypt. Israel, the nation of Israel, had moved to Egypt during the famine that had arisen during the time of Joseph, and had for the last 400 years or so been in bondage in the land of Egypt to the Egyptians, serving under hard labor. And they had cried to the Lord for deliverance. God had heard them and was sending Moses to be their deliverer. So Moses heard the voice of God, and God spoke to Moses from the bush. And we see here in Exodus chapter number 3, verse number 3, it says, "And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land, and a large, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Hivites, the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. So now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression therewith, wherewith the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Now Moses was shocked that God would choose him to do this task. Moses didn't feel himself worthy to do it. And oftentimes when God gives us a task to do, or when we're confronted with the enormity of the task that is before us, we often feel unworthy or incapable of completing that which we know has been given us to do. Sometimes as parents we feel incapable of rearing our children in a world where it just seems that the devil and wickedness and sinfulness are so rife around us and have such an influence over our families. Or maybe sometimes we look at the impossible task of remaining pure in a world such as ours, even on a personal level, and feel that that task is too much for us. Or maybe God has given us something specific to do. Like in my situation, God has called me to preach and to pastor church, and at times it may seem like that task is just too great for a person to accomplish, and in reality it is too great for a person to accomplish. That's kind of the point. But Moses, when he was confronted with this task by God, gave God 5 different excuses, or gave God 5 different responses, rather, as to what it was God wanted to do and how Moses felt inadequate. And often they're the type of responses we give to God too. So I want to look at those just briefly during this devotion time. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 11, we see Moses' first response. Moses said unto God, Who am I, that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And yes, that's oftentimes how we feel, isn't it? It's like, who am I to do such a thing? Or who am I to undertake such a great task for the Lord? When Isaiah was called to be a prophet, and was confronted with that vision from the Lord, he had a very similar response. He said that he was a man of unclean lips, and he lived amongst a nation of unclean lips and didn't feel worthy to be the mouthpiece of God. And so often that's our first response. We just do not feel worthy to be God's vessel. And honestly, we're not. We're not worthy at all. We're just sinners, saved by grace. We're made of the same flesh, the same clay, if you will, as anybody else. And it is not our worthiness that God is looking for. It's our willingness that God is looking for and our reliance upon him. God tells him, verse 12, he said, certainly I will be with thee. So he says, Moses, he said, it's okay. It's not really about you. It's about God. But God uses people, and God chooses whom he will. And if God chooses us, it's a great honor and a great blessing. And yes, we ought to remain humble and ought to face the task with humility and grace, as the task is greater than us, and it is God who chooses us. We don't choose ourselves, but we must remember, we're not worthy, but we need to be willing. The second thing he says here is found in verse number 13. And Moses said unto God, behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, the God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? And that's the second thing. A response that we might say to the Lord is, Lord, I really don't have any abilities. I really don't know what it is I'm supposed to do. I have no knowledge or no understanding of what the task is or what it entails. I'm going to go to these people. They're going to ask me who you are. I don't even know what to say to them. I have no idea the enormity of the task. And oftentimes that is the case. We don't know what the task is that is involved with that. When I was 16 years of age, I felt the call of God to preach and to serve him. And I didn't know all that entailed. I had no idea what the future held. I had no idea what that meant, that I would go to Bible college. I had no idea what that meant, that God would move me from one place to another at times and put me in different positions. I had no idea what that meant. At the time, I didn't even want to be a preacher. When I surrendered to the Lord, I surrendered to the Lord to work in a deaf ministry because I didn't want to be a speaker. I didn't want to speak. I was very uncomfortable with that idea. But Moses said, he said, what am I going to say? He said, I don't even know what to say, Lord. And it's okay. It's okay because God has the message. It says in verse 14, and God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. So it's not up to us to come up with the message. It is up to God to give us the message that we are supposed to bring. The next response of Moses is in chapter 4, verse 1. Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. And that's the third thing that becomes oftentimes our response to the Lord when God has given us a task, especially involving other people, is we say to the Lord, well, it really isn't going to matter what I say or what I do because no one's really going to listen. No one's really going to change. No one's going to care what it is that I have to say or what it is that I have to bring to the table, Lord. So it isn't going to matter if I go or not because nobody's going to turn to you. No one's going to believe me. And that may be the case. Honestly, it may be the case. In fact, it was for the prophets. When God called the prophets, he told them, I am sending you to a hard-hearted people whose ears will not hear and who will not turn, who will not repent, and who will not come back to me. So that may be the case. But even if it is the case, if God is telling us to go and do something, we need to be willing to go and do it. Sometimes God is sending us as a witness against someone so that there really is no excuse for them. The Bible tells us that the creation witnesses of the Lord so that none of us have an excuse at all. But sometimes God sends people on purpose into the lives of others so that, because God knows what they're going to do, God knows their heart, God knows exactly their response is going to be, but as a witness against them and against the fact that they have a hard heart against the Lord, and he needs them to see that for themselves, and he needs us to go about and to explain that, to show that. But whether or not people turn to the Lord, whether or not people respond to what it is we have been given to do by God, that does not make the task any less important, nor does it make us any less responsible to be willing to do what God calls us to do. The next thing is found in verse 10. Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. So Moses is saying, I'm not equipped. So I'm just not equipped First, I'm not qualified. But even if I was qualified, he said, I don't have the proper equipment. I don't have the proper training. I don't have maybe the proper schooling, the proper knowledge. My speech, I stammer. I don't talk very well. I'm not very skilled in the area to which you're calling me, Lord. Therefore, it must be a mistake. Isn't that the truth, though? But yet, the Bible tells us God calls the foolish to confound the wise. And he calls the weak to confound the mighty. God knows what he's doing when he chooses us, when he chooses one of us or some of us that don't have it all together and don't have all of the ability and don't have all of the knowledge and wisdom in the world. God knows exactly what he's doing when he calls those to serve him. He calls them because they are going to rely on God all the more. It's like when Jesus chose the apostles. Whom did he choose? Well, many of them were fishermen. They were fishers by trade. In fact, when the priests confronted Peter and John in the temple, so they knew they were unlearned and ignorant men. They knew that. Yet they knew they had been with Jesus, and that made all the difference. Because even in our lack of learning and lack of knowledge, and even in our ignorance and weakness, if God calls us, God himself will equip us to do what it is he has called us to do. Through the power of his Spirit and through the gifts the Holy Spirit gives, he will equip us and prepare us, and he has made us for a very specific task. It is, again, not our ability that God is seeking, it is our willingness that God is seeking. Goes a little bit further here, if you will, in verse 11 of chapter 4, and the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or deaf or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. So God says, listen. So you say you can't speak. He said, who do you think gave you the mouth to speak with? I did. You say you don't know. He said, who's the one that gave you the knowledge that you have? I did. I can be with you. I can be with your mouth. I can be with your mind. I will give you what it is you need. God's saying is, I am the equipper. I'm looking for a willing vessel, not a perfect vessel. He goes on to say, lastly, Moses gives him one more response, and that's verse 13. And he, that is Moses, said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. And basically, what Moses is saying is this. He's saying, okay, God, I get it. You know, you can do all this stuff, but just choose someone else. Choose anyone else to go and do the task that you're asking me to do. Just send someone else. Send anyone else. I mean, if you can be with them, and if you can guide them, and if you can make their mouth speak, and you can tell them what it is that they're supposed to say, he said, you can do that for somebody else. So go ahead and send whomever else you want to send. Just don't send me. And this is very interesting. Verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. God was a little upset. He said, come on, Moses, that's enough of this. Enough of this. If it's that bad, he said, I'll give you somebody to go with you. He said, I'll send Aaron alongside you, and he can go with you down into Egypt, and he can help you and stand by your side, and he can speak on your behalf, and he can do the miracles and show everything going on. He said, I'll send Aaron alongside, but Moses, you need to go. Now, let me just say in closing, God has chosen each one of us for a specific task on this earth. It may not be to be a pastor or a missionary. It may not be to be a Sunday school teacher, but God has given us some responsibility. God has given us some ability to reach somebody for him. All of us have that. God's not looking for eloquence. God's not looking for wisdom and knowledge necessarily. God's not looking for the best looking person, the best speaking person, the wisest person. He's looking for the willing person. So God has made us for a task. He's asked us to be willing, and he's told us, I'll go with you. I'll speak with you. I'll help you. I've made your mouth. I've made you for what it is I'm calling you to do. Are you willing to go? But often, like Moses, we'll say things like, well, who am I? Really, who am I? Or what is it I can say? Or they'll not believe me anyway, so what does it matter if I go? Or I'm not very eloquent. I'm not very equipped to do this. Or, Lord, if you can do that for me, you can do that with anybody. Just send someone else. But God wants us all to be willing to take on the task to which he has created us. God bless you, and I hope to see you all again very, very soon.